Scranton, Pennsylvania, February 1902. At the dead end of the Lackawanna yards, where broken couplers lay in weeds and coal dust turned the snow gray, Stefan Marek was doing something that made experienced railroadmen stop walking. He was building a room inside a condemned baggage car. But that was not the strangest part. The strangest part was this. He would not let the room touch the car, not with a nail, not with a bolt, not even with a careless scrap of iron. Every time a board leaned too close to the frozen shell, Marek pulled it back and measured the gap again. 5 inches. Always 5 inches. The division foreman, Elijah Crow, stood in the open doorway with 2-yard hands behind him, both grinning like men waiting for a fool to finish proving it. Crow had run repair gangs through 3 Pennsylvania winters. He knew what cold did to machinery. He knew what cold did to men. He looked at the pine frame floating inside the baggage car and said, "Marek, what are you building?" Stefan set down his mallet. His coat was patched at both elbows. His beard was dark with coal dust. His hands were square, scarred, and calm. "A house," he said. One of the yard hands laughed. "A house? Inside that iron coffin?" Crow did not laugh. He was angrier than that. "That car is company scrap," he said. "The first time Philadelphia asks for the metal, they'll drag it out of here with your stove still warm." Marek nodded once, as if Crow had mentioned the weather. "I paid the scrap clerk." "You paid for lumber and fittings," Crow snapped. "Not a dwelling. And even if the company lets you keep it, the cold will not." He rapped his knuckles against the baggage car wall. "This skin will freeze solid. The floor will freeze. The roof will sweat frost. You'll wake up with ice on your blankets." Marek looked at the metal wall. Then he looked at the 5-inch empty space between that wall and the pine frame he had built inside it. "No," he said quietly, "the iron will freeze. Not the house." That sentence traveled faster than steam through the yard. By supper, every man near the Scranton shops had heard about the Slovak carpenter who thought he could live inside a dead railroad car by leaving a little useless air around the walls. They called it Marek's coffin. They called it the frost barrel. They called it proof that a man could be skilled with tools and still have no sense at all. But Stefan Marek was not building from hope. He was building from memory. Before Scranton, before the black hills of anthracite and the wooden boarding houses that shook in the wind, Marek had worked in the railway carriage shops at Košice. He had built interiors for sleeping coaches that crossed mountain borders at night. He had fitted cedar panels that would not rattle loose on bad track. He had packed walls so quietly and carefully that a paying passenger could sleep in a warm berth while ice formed on the outside of the glass. Those cars had taught him a truth most house carpenters in Scranton had never needed to name. A wall was not one thing. A wall was a negotiation. There was the surface that fought weather. There was the layer that trapped air. There was the interface that kept a human body from feeling the fight. And between those layers there had to be separation. Without separation, cold found a bridge. Stefan had learned that lesson with a file, a chisel, and 2 ruined fingers in a European coach shop. He relearned it during his first winter in Pennsylvania. The Mareks rented 2 rooms behind a coal dealer's stable on the south side of Scranton. The landlord called it a house because it had walls and a stovepipe. Stefan called it a crate. The boards had shrunk. The plaster had cracked. Every stud ran straight from the clapboards to the room inside, and every iron nail was a tiny road for winter. By December, their wash water froze overnight in a blue enamel basin. By January, Stefan's wife, Anka, had learned to keep the baby's socks inside her apron so they would be warm enough to put on in the morning. The ash shovel froze to the hearthstone twice. The rag curtain over the window went stiff with frost, and had to be peeled away from the glass like bark. The worst part was not the cold, it was the price of losing to it. A stove could be fed all night and still lose the room by dawn. A family could burn coal until the belly of the stove glowed dull red and still feel the floor stealing warmth through their shoes. The neighbors thought this was simply winter. Stefan did not. He saw the house the way a coach builder sees a bad car. Not as a place, as a machine with a failure in it. The outside cold touched the siding touched the studs touched the inner wall. The iron nails tied all of it together. The cold did not need to break in. It had been invited. That was the bridge. Heat moved through solid contact, through wood, through metal, through every fastener that connected the world outside to the room inside. The company houses were full of bridges. So were the workers' cabins along the rail line. The men blamed thin walls. Stefan blamed continuous walls. They tried to defeat winter by making bigger fires. He decided to make the fire less important. In late autumn, he found the condemned baggage car on a repair spur, 34 feet long, with a dented roof, cracked end doors, and enough sound frame left to stand another decade if no one moved it. The scrap clerk let it go for $12.40. Because the company wanted the trucks, the brass, and the salvageable fittings more than the shell. Marek bought none of the things his neighbors expected. Not clapboard, not shingles, not a wagon load of brick. He spent $34.80 on corkboard, wool felt, heavy roofing paper, pine tongue and groove, and 3 sacks of dry sand to seal the floor edges. Crow saw the materials stacked beside the track and shook his head. "Cork is for ice rooms," he said. Marek lifted one sheet. "Yes, for keeping cold in." "Yes," Marek said. "Or out." The yard hands laughed again. Marek did not answer them. He started with the floor. That was the first part. Everyone else forgot. A roof looked dramatic. A wall got blamed. But the floor was where a man lived all day without noticing the theft. The baggage car sat above frozen ballast and iron rail, and the cold below it was not passing weather. It was stored cold, patient cold. A black reservoir under the boards. Stefan laid 2 inches of cork across the entire floor, edge to edge, and sealed the seams with paper and pitch. Then he laid pine sleepers on top, not iron brackets. Not through bolts. Wood on cork, cork on old car floor, no clean road for the coal. Next he raised the inner room. The frame stood inside the baggage car like a second, smaller car. It did not touch the outer wall. It did not touch the roof. It did not even lean against the side posts. When the frame needed steadying, Stefan used wooden pegs and short blocks set through scraps of felt. Each contact point small, dry, and broken by something that would not drink heat like iron. Crow watched one afternoon as Marek rejected a perfectly good box of carriage bolts. "You're making it weaker," Crow said. "I am making it separate. Separate things come apart." Marek pushed a peg through a drilled hole and tapped it home. "Only if they are meant to pull." He pointed to the dark space around the frame. "This is meant to wait." That space became the heart of the house. 5 inches around the walls, 6 inches above the ceiling. Every cavity packed with wool felt, not rammed hard because crushed insulation loses its trapped air, not left loose because gaps become channels. He laid it in layers and fluffed it with his fingers until the whole little room was wrapped in trapped stillness. Still air was the cheapest miracle in the world. Not moving air, not wind, not a draft. Still air. Air caught in wool fibers, unable to circulate, unable to carry heat away. That was what a Pullman berth had known. That was what a working man's house had forgotten. By the time he installed the inner pine walls, the baggage car looked ordinary from the outside and almost impossible from the inside. A narrow wooden room glowed inside a black industrial shell. The windows were small and deep, set like tunnels through the layers. The door was 10 inches thick, not because Stefan loved heavy doors, but because a thin door would have betrayed every careful inch around it. Anka hung a curtain by the sleeping alcove. Their son Pavel stacked kindling beside the stove. Their daughter Lydia pressed both palms against the pine wall and said it felt warm even before the fire was lit. That evening, Elijah Crow walked by again. The stovepipe was up. The door was sealed. A little smoke rose into the gray yard. Crow stood with his collar turned up. "You understand," he called. "If this goes wrong, men will say I let it happen." Stefan slid the door open just enough for his face to show. "If it goes wrong," he said, "I will not be here to hear them." Crow did not smile. Neither did Marek, because both men knew winter was nearly ready to judge them. It came after New Year's. Not as deep snow. Snow would have been kinder. It came as wet rain from the south, heavy and steady, falling into air that was already dying below freezing. By evening, every rail shone under glass. By morning, the telegraph wires hung fat and bright, trembling under ice. Coal wagons slid sideways in the streets. Tree limbs split in the dark with cracks like pistol shots. Then the temperature fell. For 2 days, Scranton became a town locked inside a bottle. Every roof collected weight. Every gutter became a blade. The company houses, with their patched shingles and tired rafters, began to fail one at a time. At the Elephant Row houses, a roof seam opened and let freezing rain into 4 bedrooms. Near the breaker, a porch roof collapsed under a slab of ice as thick as a Bible. Families moved bedding into kitchens. Men burned broken chairs. Children slept wearing mittens. By the 3rd night, the thermometer outside the yard office showed 19 below zero. The wind came down the valley hard enough to make the signal lamp swing. It found every crack in every ordinary house. It pushed under doors. It drove through nail holes. It turned wet plaster into white crust. Elijah Crow spent the next morning walking damage with a ledger in one hand, and his temper worn down to nothing. He saw women carrying mattresses across frozen mud. He saw a man chopping apart his own back fence for stove fuel. He saw water pipes split open and bloom with ice like white flowers. One of the yard hands who had laughed at Marek was sleeping with his family in the machine shop office. Crow wrote it all down. Roof failure, frozen line. Stove pipe leak, interior frost, uninhabitable, uninhabitable. Uninhabitable. Then the survey took him to the forgotten spur. He expected to find the baggage car dead, maybe the pipe blown loose, maybe the door frozen shut, maybe the Mareks gone to the parish hall with everyone else. Instead, he stopped 20 yards away and lowered the ledger. The old car stood under a perfect skin of ice. The curved roof was a smooth white back. The sides were armored in clear glaze. The iron steps glittered, and from the stovepipe rose one thin, steady thread of smoke. Not frantic smoke, not the dark belch of a stove being overfed. A quiet thread, a comfortable thread. Crow walked closer. The wind slammed against the car and slid over it. There were no shingles to lift, no eaves to catch, no loose siding for the storm to pull. The outside looked frozen enough to kill anything inside. Crow put his gloved hand to the metal. It was cold. Of course it was cold. But it was only the outside cold. It did not feel like a thief dragging heat from the room beyond it, because the room beyond it was not touching it. He climbed the icy step and looked through the little window. At first, his own breath fogged the glass. He rubbed a circle clear with his glove. Inside, he saw Stefan Marek sitting at the table without his coat. Pavel was on the floor, carving a little locomotive from a scrap of pine. Lydia was asleep on a blanket near the stove, not under 3 quilts, not curled in misery, simply asleep. Anka stood beside a shelf, holding a glass jar close to the light. The jar was alive. Not alive in the way a machine is alive. Alive in the old kitchen way. Bubbles rose through a rye sourdough starter she had carried from her mother's house across the ocean. Every other kitchen starter Crow knew had frozen into a dead paste that week. But this one was moving, breathing, working. In a railroad car covered with ice, Crow knocked. The door opened. Warm air touched his face. Not furnace heat, not a blast, not the desperate scorch of a stove fighting a losing room. It was steady warmth, floor warmth, wall warmth, the kind of warmth that belongs to a place, not a fire. Crow stepped inside and forgot to remove his hat. The thermometer above the shelf read 63 degrees. The stove was small enough to shame him. A single scuttle of coal sat beside it, still half full. He turned slowly, looking at the deep windows, the corked floor, the pine walls, the felt visible in one unfinished corner. He had spent 20 years assuming a good wall was a thick wall. Now he was standing inside a thin room that had beaten half the town because it had refused direct contact with the cold. "The car is frozen," he said. Marek nodded. "Yes, but this room is not." "No." Crow pointed at the gap behind the unfinished trim. "That empty space." "Not empty," Marek said. "Air wool, no bridge." Crow looked again at the glass jar. Bubbles rose, slow and stubborn, through the dough. A little living proof. He understood then why the thing bothered him. It was not that Marek had built a warm shelter. A clever stove could make a shelter warm for an hour. It was that Marek had changed the terms of the fight. The town was trying to heat winter. Marek was only heating a room. For the next 10 minutes, Crow asked questions like a younger man. How thick was the cork? 2 inches. How much wool? 5 inches in the walls, 6 above. Why no iron fasteners? Because iron was a road. Why the deep door? Because a wall is only as good as its weakest interruption. Why did the window not sweat? Because the inner sash was set back from the outer shell, and the air between them slowed the change. Crow took off his hat. It was not apology exactly. It was the beginning of one. "You built a house inside a coat," he said. Marek shook his head. "A coat touches the body." He tapped the pine wall. "This does not touch the weather." Crow looked at the iced metal beyond the little window, then back at the warm room. "My God," he said, "you built a winter ship." The name stayed, not officially. Crow wrote it up as a double unfloat rail shelter, utilizing cork separation, felt-packed cavities, and non-metallic internal bracing. But men in the yard called it the winter ship. And because Crow was a company man, he knew how to make a miracle sound like a savings plan. His report did not begin with wonder. It began with fuel. The Marek shelter had held above 60 degrees through a 19 below night, with less than 1/3 the coal burned in a standard line shack. It had taken no roof damage in gale conditions. It had used a retired car body the company was preparing to scrap. It could be assembled by 2 carpenters and 1 helper in under 12 working days after materials were staged. It reduced sick time. It protected tools from condensation. It kept men alive on exposed stretches of line where ordinary shanties failed. By spring, the Lackawanna shops built the first company version near a mountain switch house west of Pocono Summit. By the next winter, 5 more stood along exposed maintenance points. By 1904, 9 Marek pattern shelters were in service, all built from damaged or retired rail bodies the company already owned. Stefan Marek was moved out of the General Yard Carpenter gang and into special structures. His wage did not triple, but it rose enough for Anka to buy a stove that was not second-hand. He never made speeches about it. He never told the men who had laughed that they were fools. When Elijah Crow brought visitors to see one of the new shelters, Marek simply showed them the gap. Always the gap. He would place 1 hand on the outer shell and 1 hand on the inner pine. The weather may live there, he would say. We live here. That was the whole lesson. Not luxury, not invention from nowhere, not a poor man's trick, a system. The outer shell took wind and rain. The cork broke the cold from below. The wool held still air. The wooden frame avoided the iron roads. The inner wall gave the family a human room inside an inhuman season. Modern builders would later call parts of this idea a thermal break. They would talk about building envelopes, continuous insulation, separated frames, and conductive pathways. They would put better names on what Marek had already understood with a mallet in his hand and frost in his beard. Cold does not only enter through holes. Sometimes it enters through the very things meant to hold a house together. Through the stud, through the nail, through the bracket, through the proud, solid connection nobody thinks to question. The strongest wall is not always the thickest. Sometimes it is the one that knows when not to touch. That is why the old baggage car outlasted the storm. Not because iron is warm. Iron is not warm. Not because Stefan Marek found a way to defeat winter. No man defeats winter in the mountains of Pennsylvania. He did something better. He gave winter a shell to freeze. Then he built his family's life just beyond its reach. The true wall was not the metal everyone saw. It was the space he refused to let the cold cross.